Well, hello and good afternoon and good morning to you joining us on the next organising webinar. UNISON's organising webinars. This is number 6, I think, of our series of webinars. We've got a lot of people here today. I think we've got over 160 registered, which is fantastic. So it's a whole mixture of people who's staff. We've got activists here. I can see different people. Some names I know, some names I don't know, which is nice. So you're very, very welcome. And we're very pleased that you're here to join with us. That's fantastic. I'm just going to keep talking so that you can adjust your sound, so that if you've got any audio problems or issues you need to change, you can do that. So I will just keep talking, and I can see different people here from all over the UK. We've got people here from London. There are some people from Europe, some from Ireland, and all from right across the UK. That's fantastic. Really, really nice. And you're absolutely very welcome. They've got quite a few webinars going on with UNISON at the moment. I think we are clashing with other ones, but that's absolutely fine because we're going to record this one. So people who are missing it, I've had a few contacts from people who are really sorry that they're not going to be able to be here with us. And just to let you know that this session is being recorded, and once it's been processed, I will send out the link to everybody who's attended, and I'll put it on the organising space and different bits and pieces, so you can access that. And if you don't get it or anything, just email me, and I'll be able to send that out to you. It usually takes about 5-10 minutes for it to get processed, and then we can send the recording out. The numbers are just going up again now, so it seems to come in dribs and drabs, which is fine, and everybody is very welcome to join us. But this is, I would say, one of the most special webinars that we've ever done here at UNISON. And I'm going to just do a little bit of a tech intro now. Yes, I think we can do that. Just so that if you're not used to this system, on the right hand side you'll see a dashboard. And on the dashboard, there's a big button with an audio on. So if you're having problems hearing what's happening and what people are saying, you can also phone up as well and listen. So if you've got issues around your Wi-Fi, etc., then you can do it that way. As I said before, we're going to record the webinar. The timings, we're going to do 1 hour. We won't be going over 1 hour. So I will disappear and I'll come back in again 10 minutes to the end. And if you would like to ask a question of our 2 panelists here today, please feel free to put it in the chat or in the question area on the toolbar at the side. If we have time, I'm not sure we're going to have time, but please just put your questions there and I can get the answers to you afterwards if needs be. That's not a problem at all. And I think that's it really. I think that's everything I needed to say. And just to say, you know, I'm very lucky in the job I do at UNISON, because there are days like this that are absolutely tremendous, and I'm very, very lucky and so proud to welcome our guests today. So I'm going to hand over to Roger McKenzie, our Assistant General Secretary, who will do further introductions. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you as always, Monica, and thanks for all you've done to set up this this very special webinar. I'd say, I mean, Monica's right. I mean, there are some days where it's just an absolute pleasure. I'm always really proud to work for UNISON. Always really proud to be part of our labour movement. And one of the things I think that makes it a really proud movement to belong to is about some of the friends and some of the people we make. We're all in struggle all the time, and sometimes it seems hard. And one of the things that I think lifts you is when you're able to meet and work with really special people. And I'm really proud to say that we've got really special guests with us today. We have with us Bill Lucy, who was the former Secretary Treasurer of AFSCME, which is the American Federation of State, County and Municipal Employees. also a former president of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. And apart from that, just a really good friend and mentor of mine. So we'll hear more about Bill's background as we go through the conversation. But for the moment, can I just really thank you, Bill, for taking the time to come and join us today.
My absolute pleasure, Roger. My pleasure.
Great. So, I mean, what we try and do in these discussions, I mean, all of these discussions are about organising. And what I thought we would really major on for this discussion is what I think is one of the key disputes of certainly the civil rights era, but I think wider than that as well. I think it would just be a mistake just to place this as just being something that took place during the civil rights era. I think this had major implications for workers everywhere, not just Black workers, and that's the Memphis sanitation workers strike of 1968. But leading up to that, Bill, I wonder if you could just say something about how you got involved in the trade union movement in the first place.
Well, Roger, I was employed in the public sector for about 12 or 13 years. After getting out of school, I went to work for the U.S. Navy. And in 1951 or 2, a major movement took place in the public sector here in the U.S., where Dwight Eisenhower got committed to a national highway and roads program called the Federal Aid to Secondary and Highway Construction. And any number of counties had to, in order to participate in the program, had to gear up on the engineering side and the planning side in order to participate in that national program. And I went to work for Contra Costa County in 1953 in the engineering section, particularly in materials and testing, because we were required to measure up to certain standards to do that. So that became a starting career in organized labor. I ran the materials and testing laboratory and had a number of individuals who worked in the laboratory who I had responsibility over. And it was in that context that I sort of learned how unfair the process and the system could be if you were a victim of it. And I began to think about, as a worker, how do we address that system where fairness comes out of it, where you're able to do what you're hired to do without the pressures of political appointees or the unfairness that comes if you're just a simple worker with no protection either from a trade union or an association or what have you. You just sort of on your own. I joined the Employee Association at that time, an organization of about 8,000 workers in our county. But it was not a true trade union. It did not have the vision and value of what a trade union ought to be. So I became interested in how do we change this so that as an institution, it protects the interests of the workers. And that took some time. I learned that what everything says on paper is not what it practices.
Yeah.
And I became involved as an active member, trying to talk about what we should be doing on behalf of the employees and workers we represented. And I learned the difference between an association and a true trade union. And the difference between the courthouse crowd and the public works yard crowd, and that their interest was different and the mechanics of representing them was different. I and several other folks engaged in a conversation on how do we change this 8,000 member organization into a true trade union. And took about a year or so to do that, and we entertained the conversation of what is a union and what is the role of a union in a society where a number of workers were just discarded and not treated with the respect they were entitled to. And another set of workers, simply because of their classification, got all the good things that went with that. So it took us about 2 years, and we had a vote on the question of, do we want to be an association or do we want to be a union? We voted to become a union, where immediately we lost about 1,500 members. but the 6,000 or more that was left were truly committed to building a mechanism that could truly represent the interests of working people.
I'm interested, Bill, can I just interrupt? I'm interested in the kind of process that you went through to win that argument, basically, because that strikes me as quite a big organizational kind of, I mean, number one, you couldn't have been doing that on your own. There must have been other people involved, I guess, but that's quite a process to win that change of kind of attitude.
I think, Roger, everyone understood that there was something lacking in our relationship with the employer. We had a process that we call collective bidding as opposed to collective bargaining. And that we would only get to that if we made a conscious decision that we wanted to be and we're entitled to have a seat at the table when decisions were being made about our work life, irrespective of whether it was just wages, but working conditions as a benefit. We had a civil service system, but we realized that the system had gone far beyond what its original mandate was. The civil service function originally was to select people who qualified to be hired. We had a system that had moved on to deciding how many vacation days you got, how many sick days you got, what your pay level was going to be, far beyond what it was originally set up to be. And we didn't resist it, but we wanted to have a seat at the table when these decisions were being made. And you're correct. This was not we saw this as a revolution, and we knew that no revolution starts with majority support. So, so we set out to do an education job, to learn more about things we needed to know, how the system worked, and what we thought the benefits could be if we were successful. And we managed to perform an educational process that about 6,000 people said this makes sense. We lived in a labor county, so our political relationships were important from a labor perspective. We had elected officials who were our employers, and our view was that most politicians, by and large, was cut from the same boat with cloth. They would respond to what we could do for them or what we could do to them. And so we set out to at least build power that would represent the interests of working people. And after a while, we began to see the results of that. And I began to understand that there is a role that a labor organization is responsible for to its members. And secondarily, there's a responsibility that members have to the organization to not only help build it, but keep it strong and keep it focused. And I served with that organization until 1966. And at that time, I go back to the massive highway construction program that Dwight Eisenhower had initiated. So public sector organizing became a national phenomenon. And public sector workers were getting out of the notion of being public servants, but being public employees and having all the rights that a private sector employee would have who did the same thing. Our argument was, you know, a truck driver for the public sector is no different than a truck driver for the private sector, or an engineer and a surveyor, an architect, a nurse, you know, all of these jobs that were not necessarily interchangeable, but perform the same function for a public employer, or the same requirements and needs that a private sector employee did for a private employer. And we made the argument that we ought to have access to collective bargaining. We ought to participate side by side with the civil service system, but our interests would be to reflect the basic needs of our membership. You know, there was no written law that says that an employee should only get 1% or 2% increase in pay. They should get the kind of increase that the environment called for. And so we began to make that case, not just with our individual employer, but in our countywide system. The makeup of the workforce, we had everything you would find in the public sector. And so we were representing various interests, but we had to establish guidelines for representing and reflecting all of that as a part of our basic program. It had a civil rights side to it, because there were jobs that were essentially unskilled jobs. And our argument was that the remuneration, the benefits, ought to reflect the importance of the job. And we had to make this case for an awful lot of workers. So that was essentially where I sort of began to understand that there's a major role and responsibility that organized labor has for certain kinds of employees.
So what was the link from there? So how do you make the step from what you just described to AFSCME to become a staff member at AFSCME?
Well, in 1964, there was a major contest for the leadership of our organization. We had only one president up to that point in time, and his views were limited to his experiences. He had always worked in the public sector, had no understanding of the problems that exist below a higher level of employer. Meaning that if I was a sanitation worker, as an example, my salaries, my benefits, my conditions of employment were what the traffic would bear. Well, I mean, nobody really thought an awful lot about the role of a sanitation worker or a street sweeper or of any of that, because people generally didn't see that as relative to their own situation. You know, people generally think that a refuse collector, you know, somebody puts it outside and it disappears. Well, some worker somewhere has to come and get it and take it away. So these were the shortcomings that we saw. And in '64, that debate took place inside of our national union. And it was a debate between the then president for 25 or 30 years and a new outlook fostered by a fellow by the name of Jerry Worth, who saw workers as part of a valuable piece of the public sector. We made the system work, and if we had high quality workers, we'd get high quality service, whether it's in our hospitals or any other sector of the work that we were doing for the public. So I became a part of that discussion, you know, reflecting what I just shared with you as to what Contra Costa County was doing and why we were doing it and what we thought the long range benefits would be for the service itself, but also for the workers who were providing the service. And at that time, our national union did not have a presence at the national level where major policies were being made that affected the public sector. A part of this Eisenhower program was to give grants to state government for doing particular parts of what was being perceived as federal work. Well, if we were not present, not at the table, let's say, we couldn't receive those benefits. So we created a department called Department of Community Legislation and Community Affairs, and began to represent the public sector in Washington, D.C. before the Congress and at state levels of government before state legislatures, making the argument for public sector support and key issues important to the public sector. Social services, power, utilities, are all done by public employees with less of a voice than private sector employees who did the same job. And I came to work for the National Union in 1966, where the organization set up a department called Legislation and Community Affairs, and they hired somebody to work for them who only had a loud voice. but the argument we were making about the rights of public employees to be treated and have a seat at the table as private sector employees caught on. It caught on in a way that just went across the country. Our organizing efforts, just on the basis of what we were talking about doing, we were netting like 50,000 net new members each year, simply talking to people about their rights to be treated with respect, with dignity, to have a voice in decisions that affected their work life.
So did you say these were net increases? 50,000 net increase each year? Wow. Each year.
And it was a very new thing in the public sector.
Yeah.
We began to discuss this concept with other independent associations on the hopes that they en masse as a block would come over to our organizations or any other organizations like ours who were making the case that public employees were entitled to be treated with a degree of decency and respect.
I mean, I think we see a lot of what you're talking about there reflected in some of the things that are happening today. I mean, just to throw in, because I mean, obviously we've heard a lot said in this country, and I guess in the US as well, about what is an essential worker, what's a valuable worker, and it just seems to me that we're going back to those same arguments, that same debates that you went through, you know, asserting the right of workers to asserting the worth of workers, really, and getting employers and governments to understand that nothing happens without working people doing the jobs that are, as you were indicating, virtually invisible to lots of people, I think.
Well, Roger, some of the I would say simple issues. I mean, we have a teacher who is responsible for shaping the minds of our young people. It's not treated with the respect of somebody who sits behind a desk and passes paper all day long. I mean, the lack of value placed on things that I call quality of life services. That was not in the 60s was not a key issue that reflected itself in the role and responsibility of individuals who did those jobs. You know, we see this argument that the private sector does it better. Well, the private sector may do good, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's better. I mean, if I was forced to choose a rest home for my grandmother, I'm not sure I want her eating a hamburger prepared by the lowest bidder. You know, I mean, that's the kind of thinking that we try to apply to the role of the public sector. Qualified, capable people performing necessary functions. And we believed, at least in our county, if we were able to do that, we would have a better quality of service, justified argument for paying better taxes and getting better and more service. And that's the logic that we apply to the growth of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees.
Can we, because I think those are really compelling, really important arguments that I think we all have to go back to, really, for today's kind of environment that we're in. Let's talk about the Memphis sanitation workers strike, because that's the, for me, as I said earlier on, one of the key disputes that is often only really heard about because of the link that that it had to Dr. King, but actually is much deeper than that in terms of its importance around the movement. Can you talk a little bit, Bill, about how you got involved in that dispute and some of the background to the dispute?
Well, let me say, right, the Memphis sanitation strike is really the classic contradiction in our system, where men who work every day but still could not raise themselves out of poverty because they had no process by which to do this. And let me hasten to say that the National Union did not call the strike. This is a strike that grew out of the frustration of men who had no vehicle to change their circumstance. They had no voice on their job. They had no voice with the political leadership that dictated how their job was going to be done. And the sadness of the continuous mistreatment of workers, which was so prevalent in Memphis, Tennessee, and across the South, for that matter, in those days. These were men who worked at jobs that were some of the most difficult jobs in our system. Yet these jobs were almost reserved for Black workers. Solid waste disposal across the South was some of the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs there were. And these were men who had done these jobs because they were the only jobs the system would give them. And they became committed to both organizing and building a union that very few of them knew much about, although they had heard about what unions could and should be doing. The equipment that they worked with was bad. The conditions under which they worked were bad. There was nothing called sick leave. They could get sick. If you don't work, you don't get paid. You're not guaranteed a day. I mean, it was just all of the dreadful things that labor was created to try and correct. They decided themselves that they had had enough of that process and set out to raise the issue with the city that they wanted to have a union, and they wanted the union to be recognized by the city, and that the union would be the spokesperson for the workforce. Well, in Memphis, Tennessee, in 1968, this was not a change that it was going to entertain in any way, shape, or form. No mayor, this mayor was not going to have, I hate to use the word, an organization of Black workers sitting across a table from his appointed leadership with a voice in how this work was going to be done. About February 1st, 1968, two men, brother by the name of Robert Walker and another by the name of Echo Cole, on a bad weather day, to get out of the weather, got in the back of that truck to be shielded from the rain, and apparently an electrical current triggered the packing mechanism on the truck and swooped them into the back of the truck, crushing them to death. Well, this raised again, it was a catalyst to the whole start. They were both killed. The men had complained about the equipment time and time again, nothing happened. And they themselves decided that they had simply had enough and that they were really going to take some action to draw attention from the city to that situation. I was working in the city of Detroit at the time, was asked to go down and see what this was all about. And simply put, it was a work confrontation that could have been solved simply by someone sitting down and talking about how we can cure this problem. The mayor, recently elected, but no interest in this situation. The sanitation department is almost 100% Black workers. And he was not a mayor that was going to sit down and be either suggested to or told to what to do. The strike grew out of that. And it was a strike that we as a union would not have called. No sanitation strike ought to be called in February of the coldest year in Memphis, Tennessee. I mean, you don't strike because you're mad. You don't strike because you're hurt. You strike because you can win. And if you can't win, then you should not ask people to sacrifice their well-being because you're angry. They decided they had enough. No matter what anybody said, they were going to bring their situation to the attention of the city, and they did. The union, after we saw and made some analysis of some situations, this ought to be a fairly simple thing. So the president asked if I would go down, do what I could do, and when it was wrapped up, go back to Detroit. Well, it was not quite that simple. and it was a classic struggle among workers who had spent a lifetime at the bottom of the ladder. And they were determined they were going to have their union, no matter how long it took, no matter what it took. And we got committed to it, irrespective of the lack of wisdom as to when it happened. But these were workers who were, and we only had 3 hands full of members. It was not like a massive membership thing. Ultimately, 1,300 workers were involved in this strike. And they were not workers that the city as a whole knew about or was concerned about. They were not workers that their own community knew about or were concerned about. So essentially they were on their own with the exception of what we brought to the table. So we signed on and said we would be there as long as they were able and willing to carry on the struggle. And that process involved educating the city, educating their communities, educating their religious leaders, making the community understand the nature of this work. And to this day, I'm not sure everybody does. Refuse collection or sanitation work is different kinds of work at different times of the year. These men had to put a 75-pound tub on their back and carry it from the back of the house to the front and dump it in a truck. Well, these men were old before that time. The work that they did was totally manual labor, and they had done it all of their lives. This was all they knew how to do, and this is the only job the system would give them. Wages were low. A high-paid worker made about $7 a day, down to the bottom of about a little over $5 a day. It was a dreadful situation, and so our commitment to it was just based on the situation they were confronted with. It became a civil rights focused issue simply because the workforce was all Black. The powers to be in the city recognized that and treated as such. So our job was to build a movement around this function and around these men.
One of the things that I remember most looking back on this dispute, Bill, was that, and it goes back to the point you made earlier about the worth of workers, but also I think the civil rights element to that is the worth of people, really, not just as workers but as human beings. And one of the iconic photographs, I suppose, but one of the iconic kind of methods of demonstration was the "I am a man" kind of billboard sticker posters that were used. How did that come about? I've actually always been dying to ask you that question all the years I've known you. How did that come about?
Well, Roger, we had a strike in a city that could care less about the workers. Nobody gave a thought to them. I mean, they were, like I said, the assumption was you put your refuse outside and it disappears. Nobody gives thought to the fact that someone got up about 4 a.m. in the morning, got on the back of a truck, drove to your neighborhood, picked up your garbage and put it in the truck. When you woke up, everything was perfect. Well, the ability to get people to understand the importance of that was a real job. Here were men who, from a health perspective, kept the city clean. Without them, you would have rats and vermin as large as small dogs. But these guys did a service for a city that was valuable from both an environmental point of view and a health point of view, but unappreciated. And they didn't know how to make their argument. They didn't know how to point out the fact that the health of a city related to their effectiveness in doing their job. So the union had to make that case. But it could not be made unless the employer was willing to sit down and listen to some logical thinking. Well, we had an employer whose motto in his election campaign was that the South will be proud again.
Sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar. And we had to develop a plan. Now, getting back to your question, there was no glue to hold this kind of a strike together other than the men counting on each other. During the course of trying to explain this to leadership in the community, we kept using the phrase, these are men, these are not children, these are men. So in an effort to try and find something that would really speak to their belief, we came up with this sign that says, I am a man. The sign was developed by a couple of guys, a minister by the name of Malcolm Blackburn, who was a Presbyterian, an AME minister, who pastored the church that we were using as our strike headquarters. He and I were charged with the task of finding some glue. So we just took a lot of words. It's like sometimes when you throw something on the wall and see what sticks. We came down with this, I am a man. These 4 words symbolizes what these men thought and what they believed. And it was able to say their message in as short a statement as possible. And those signs kept them together for the 67 days of this strike. Those who struck the first day, they were there the last day. They never went back to work. And I think it was their basic belief in themselves and each other that was the catalyst to this whole thing.
No, it's very, I mean, I just thought it was such a powerful, not just image, but you could see that it was an amazing way of just bringing people together and keeping people together, and understanding what for me is one of the kind of basic elements of what we do as trade unionists, is trying to get an employer to treat people with some humanity sometimes, because quite often they're, where something they scraped off the bottom of their shoe, they'll kind of tolerate workers, but actually here are grown men and women who have got families, who are trying to keep a roof over their heads, trying to feed their families, and they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity in the workplace.
Well, Roger, no one, well, I can't say absolutely no one, but very few in the city of Memphis at that time understood the nature of this work and what it took to do it. There were no break times. There was no restroom times. There was no change of clothes. There was none of this. And the guys who did this work, they accepted all of this. They did what they did, but they were treated without respect and without dignity. So those became the key elements of our message to the community, that these men, for what they do, ought to be treated with respect and dignity. The mayor, we had a conversation with him one time. He said, in his typical Southern fashion, that I've known these men all my work life.
Yeah.
And they don't need a union. They can come to me anytime they want to, like they always have, because they know I would give them the shirt off of my back. Well, this was said in a crowd where one fella got up and said, "Just give me a decent pay and I'll buy my own shirt," which reflected the depth of how they felt about this. The mayor took the position that he would not talk to the union, but he would talk to the men. So one day we brought about 900 of the men down to his office to have this conversation about what they thought they were entitled to. Naturally, the mayor went berserk, did the next best thing that he thought, and that was call the police. You can almost predict what the reaction is going to be when a political leader is in a situation where they don't have a good slogan or the right answer. But this was the start of the classic confrontation between a workforce and a city government. And as I said, it went on for 67 days.
So what brought Dr. King into supporting the dispute?
Dr. King at that time was in the process of organizing what he called the Poor People's Campaign. And it was an effort to show this nation and put a face on poverty. And these were people who worked every day, but could not get out of poverty. And across the South, and the assumption was that all the poverty was in the Deep South, which is fundamentally untrue. You've got people in the East, Northeast, Midwest, South, West. And Dr. King wanted to force Congress to come to grips with the issue of the need for a legislative process that could begin to chip away at poverty that folks were confronted with. He heard about and saw the activities taking place in Memphis. A good ally of his from past struggles, James Lawson, became a major supporter of the sanitation workers. And Mr. Lawson talked to Dr. King about what was taking place in Memphis. And Dr. King, as a visionary, saw this as a classic contradiction in our system, where we have people who work every day but are still poor. The issue is they're not receiving wages and benefits that would allow themselves to be raised out of poverty. And so his identification with the strike came about for that reason, that a nation as rich as ours, workers ought not be receiving starvation wages. And he identified with it, which was a major infusion of hope and belief that this is something worthwhile to continue doing. At this point in time, this was the longest public sector strike on record.
Oh, right, okay, I didn't know that. Okay.
And you know, with workers who had everything to lose and very little to gain, other than getting an opportunity to build themselves a union with the hope that in the future, their union and its work would give following workers a better chance. It began to show up pretty soon that this was becoming understood, that the contradiction in our system had its greatest impact on those who could least afford that kind of impact, the economic pressures. These workers, if there was a top wage, it was like $9 or $10 an hour. But out of that came their mortgage, their rent, their groceries, their electricity, their loan, everything came out of that meager salary. And they had made a decision, they were prepared for their struggle. So our job was to try and see how we could do some creative things, how we could approach the federal government, the state government, local, in a way that would bring some relief to that. But this was a difficult struggle, and I often get kind of teared up when I think about the contribution that they were willing to make just to have their union. And,
absolutely. So what was the reaction of the mayor and his officials to Dr. King's getting involved in the dispute?
Oh, they resented it to no end. They were confident that they were being made an example of, that the union had selected Memphis, and I chuckle when I say this, they had selected Memphis as a part of the effort to take over the government, starting in Memphis. They were being put upon, and that these men were being taken advantage of and being used as pawns in this much larger game. This is 1968, remember, when the politics of the nation was all in shambles. We had young people simply saying that Vietnam is not for me. I mean, there was a lot of things taking place, and they saw the strike as a part of that. It never occurred to them they paid crappy wages, no benefits, no such thing as sick leave, no vacation time, no promotional opportunities. None of that existed. And so the union is making these highfalutin promises that I will not be a part of producing. And Dr. King's message was, these are low-wage workers, workers with limited benefits. They're entitled to be treated with respect and dignity, and that will come through their participating in the bargaining process. Dr. King really made the analysis very quickly from our perspective. He really understood it. But the forces that were at work in 1968 was certainly not going to have Dr. King be a successful leader of a strike of low-wage workers. The implications of that were large, and everything that they could possibly think of doing, they undertook to do to make sure that the strike would not be successful as a result of Dr. King's participation. The assassination took place and had an incredible impact on the city, the county, and the country as a whole. Dr. King is assassinated fighting for low-wage workers and workers in the public sector. The thought was that that would dampen the spirit of the workers. It increased it. There was too much on the table, and ultimately President Johnson became involved, and the mayor became much more intransigent. President Johnson called the mayor to urge him to find a settlement, and the mayor told him, you run Washington, D.C., I run Memphis, Tennessee. And for those of us who remember Lyndon Johnson, he didn't take kindly to that kind of talk. What he did was quietly issued an order to begin to dry up the resources that went into Tennessee as a state and Memphis as a city. He then appointed a fellow by the name of James Reynolds, who was the Assistant Secretary of Labor, appointed him as a mediator to begin to find a solution to this. And while he didn't say it to us, it was clear this was going to be with or without the mayor. Mr. Reynolds set up a process by which pressures were brought to bear to bring us together. We negotiated for about 11 days and finally began to get what we saw as a possible settlement. And the mayor never came to the table. He sent someone, and ultimately we began to make some sense. There are 1,000 different things that went on in between these two events.
Yeah. But the mayor wouldn't come to the table himself, wouldn't take responsibility. Never. No.
And the irony is, and I hate to say it, and I'm reluctant to say it most times, the first day of the strike, we found a solution that was acceptable to the mayor's people and our people, but it was unacceptable to the mayor. It's as simple as that. It's incredible. So we went through 66 days of aggravation simply because the mayor refused to recognize what we were dealing with. And we certainly was not looking for a strike ourselves. We were looking to settle an issue that was as much of an issue to these men as anything. Their right to be treated with respect and dignity, to be given a seat at the table to talk about their issues, safety issues, grievance issues, issues that are fundamental to anyone who works for a living.
So was the settlement at the end of the dispute? How did that compare to the beginning? What you got at the beginning?
Raised that question because I was anticipating that question. Bear in mind that these men had no grievance procedure, they had no promotion procedure, they had no training criteria, they had nothing. So at the end of the settlement, we negotiated a set of provisions that every worker who had been on strike would go back to work without prejudice. The union would be recognized. The union would have what we call checkoff, so that it would have income so it could do its work. A wage increase. We develop a promotion policy, seniority being the basis of promotion, provisions on non-discrimination. We develop a process for I can't think of the word right now, health and safety, a retirement plan. We developed a full-fledged contractual agreement for these workers, and they ratified the agreement 100%. Now, the wage increase, which is an interesting piece, the mayor refused to put any city money into the settlement. So a industrialist, a fellow by the name of Abe Plow, who just figured this is going on long enough. So he put up all the money necessary to secure the wage increases for the ending of the strike, and an increase for 6 months later. And the strike ended, but it was not without its complications. The men had a promotional program, training, competence, capacity would be the criteria used to judge whether or not they could move from the limited job that Black workers had. That was throwing this 70 and 75 pounds of garbage. They became truck drivers, crew chiefs. Life changed for those workers in Memphis. It changed for their children. And now, while it's not a perfect situation, I don't want to kid you, it is substantially better than it was 50 years ago. And the city is better for it. We had the 50th anniversary of the strike about 2 years ago. And from around the globe, people came to see what life was like for these workers. There's still about 2 handfuls of them left. And it's a story that's worth relating every now and then.
Absolutely worth relating. Monica's appeared on the screen, which means that we're getting near the end of the time that we said. So
I'm so wordy, Monica. I apologize.
It's okay. It's fine. It's fantastic.
What I always anybody who comes on this webinar, I always ask them about a book that they'd recommend people either reading around what they've talked about or that they've found to be important to them. Have you got anything that you'd like to recommend, Bill?
Well, I got two things, Roger. I'd like to recommend that you or whoever is interested read the book by a writer by the name of Michael Harrington called The Other America, because I don't care how we publicize it, there are two different Americas. There's the well-to-do who eats 3 times a day, and there's the rest of the workers who have to figure out how they're going to eat 3 times a day. And Mike's book talked about the role of organized labor in these processes. He focused on Appalachia and the poverty that exists there and the wealth that exists there and has been taken out of it but not enjoyed by the people who did the work. The other is Michael Honey's book, as I said earlier, Going Down Jericho Road, because Michael's book talks about the plight of low-wage workers in the South leading into the Memphis situation. Then it talks about the personal lives of many of the strikers in Memphis. Both are stories worth looking at.
Yeah, I've read the Michael Honey book. I mean, outstanding book, outstanding academic, historian as well. But more than an academic, I mean, that's not enough to describe Michael. Actually, Michael Honey is a really good activist as well. So, big good recommendations, I'd say. We're running out of time now, so there's so much more to talk to you about. But would you come back on a future webinar and continue the conversation?
I'd be
excellent.
Come back. It would be a joy of limited life.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for having me, Roger. I appreciate it.
No. I mean, the appreciation is from me. I mean, it's been an absolute honor as always to talk to one of my real friends and mentors in the movement. I'll just so Monica, do you want to do is there a quick wind up you want to do before I say a few closing words?
Yeah, just to say that the response has been tremendous I've been busy at the back here just answering calls and people. There are lots of questions come in, but I can forward those to you. Lots of things about we've got somebody who's just joined the union and wanted your advice on what the best way forward. All sorts of things. It's brought up a lot of things. People saying that they're quite moved listening to Mr. Lucy talking, and they feel inspired, which is fantastic. So thank you very much, and thank you from everybody as well. Been a proper success.
So before we finish, again,
Yep.
thanks to Bill for giving up your time to come with us on this conversation today, and we'll rearrange the next part of the conversation as quickly as we can. The next thing I want to say to everybody is that the next webinar that we've got lined up is with with Asad Rehman, who is the Executive Director of War on Wants, who's going to come and talk to us about his experiences growing up as an Asian activist in the UK, but also his work at War on Want as well. Really important work that they do there. So that's on July the 14th, next week. So that'll be one worth coming to for sure. The next thing I want to just say to everybody is just to send out solidarity greetings to workers who are on strike at Tower Hamlets in London, where all the workers there yesterday were dismissed by Labour Council and re-engaged on much worse terms and conditions. So today, I think, is the third day of their dispute. So I want to send out solidarity greetings to them. I was honoured to be able to speak at their strike rally yesterday. It's an important dispute, and can I just take the opportunity to call on the Mayor of Tower Hamlets to get back round the table and negotiate with those workers and to try and reach a settlement. But I tell you what, those workers are really determined not to be treated with such disrespect by anybody, Labour Council or not. So with that, can I once again thank Monica for all the work she's done in putting on today's webinar, and Calvin Smeeder and Joan Madden, who've also been helping to organise this. But most of all, can I thank, well, firstly, everybody for joining us and giving up their time to listen and watch this conversation. But most of all, my mentor, my friend, Bill Lucy, who I was saying to somebody the other day that when I grow up, I want to be Bill Lucy. That would be just fine by me, but I've yet to grow up, so who knows what's gonna happen. But Bill, thanks ever so much, and we'll sort out fixing up the next date for us to continue this conversation.
Monica,
thank you, Bill.
Stay in charge.
I will. You got it.
Take care.
Take care. All the best.
Bill.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to go.